So I'm here just to focus on one particular structural reform, which has what was originally called the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was signed into law in December 2017. I'm going to look at it in 5 ways, talk about the effects on GDP. This joint draws on a paper that I did with Robert Barro for the Brookings Papers on economic activity. Then I'm going to go beyond that paper to talk a little bit about national income, welfare. Then I really want to get into the question of how will we know whether or not it is working, what the impact it's having, because it's not quite as simple as drawing charts and labeling one part of them blue, one part of them red, and thinking that that constitutes an economic analysis. And finally, want to talk about what I think should be next. So start with, and sorry, I can't see this, but if I look over there, I can, with how the tax law will affect growth. Much of the journalistic and political debate has been about the first row of this. Businesses will get more cash flow either because of lower rates or they can move money from abroad. What will that do? The answer is, to a first approximation, 0, because these corporations had more than enough money to invest before. What they lacked were profitable investment opportunities. To a second approximation, it may be a small plus. But that's not really what the reform is about for good or for bad. The fiscal impact has probably gotten the second most attention. There's a very simple story. It's a positive in the short run, a Keynesian stimulus. It's a negative in the long run because we'll have additional debt, and that additional debt will crowd out investment and the like. The real action and the focus of Robert and my analysis was on row 3 there, incentives. Incentives are by lowering tax rates, by doing things like expensing, you're making an investment that didn't used to be profitable becomes profitable. So you'll move out and make some investments that you wouldn't have made before. Over time, that's a smaller positive just because some of the tax benefits phase out and some tax increases phase in, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But that's a capsule summary about what we know on GDP. In terms of the fiscal expansion, it's a 1.2% of GDP fiscal expansion this year. It's another 0.4% of GDP above and beyond that next year. That's the combination of the tax law and the spending increases. I have no doubt that that is raising GDP in the short run. I have no doubt that that's increasing employment growth in the short run. The question is what's going to happen over a longer run, and none of the data we've seen so far really shed light on that question. The flip side of this stimulus is deficits. These are deficits as a share of GDP, grow to about 5% of GDP, and then depending on what happens, whether, for example, the expiring tax cuts are made permanent, as is before the House right now, or not, you could get as high as 7% of GDP. Robert Barro and I did an extensive paper modeling the macro effects. I want to state at the outset, I agree with Roman. I would not think of these as precise point estimates. I would not have enormous confidence in any of these numbers. But we do a lot of sensitivity analysis. We show the range. And do I think this puts a bound within a factor of 10? Absolutely. And you can multiply or divide all of my numbers by 10, and it's not really going to fundamentally change the story very much. So here's how we model it. I won't really talk about what any of this is. The one I will highlight here is we make a very favorable assumption, which is that there's an infinitely elastic supply of capital, which is to say the US interest rate does not rise even though we're investing more and borrowing more. There's a huge flow of capital into the United States to pay for all of the new investment because we're certainly not paying for the new investment because we're saving less. That's a rather extreme assumption. I think at one end of the spectrum, it makes the results larger than they otherwise would have been. It turns out, what we do is disaggregate the economy, and what's going on for user costs of capital, which is a standard way of analyzing the incentives to invest more, is a little bit subtle and different from what you might have thought. The user cost for equipment goes down, but it only goes down a little bit. And actually, it's higher than what it was in 2017 when we had bonus depreciation. The tax code was more favorable to business investment in 2017 than it is in 2022. Not to business investment, to equipment investment in 2017 than 2022. There's a big boost to structures, and then something that's actually gotten less attention than it should. There's actually a very big tax increase on R&D. Part of this is a byproduct of the design of the law. You can expense R&D. Tax rates are lowered overall. That reduces the value of your interest deduction for R&D. Part of that's on purpose because starting in 3 years, you're no longer going to be able to expense your R&D. You'll have to depreciate it over 5 years. So there's deliberately a less favorable tax treatment of R&D than we have now. The pass-through sector has another set of changes. The main message there is not a lot of changes to user costs in the pass-through sector, with the exception of R&D, where there's a really big tax increase on it. So these are small businesses, sole proprietorships, and also large businesses like S corporations that don't file under the corporate tax code. Taking this all together, again, you can do a ton of sensitivity analysis around this. Here is our estimate for the impact on different forms of capital. Some forms of capital go up, R&D goes down. On average, the capital stock will be 3% higher. When will it be 3% higher? In the long run. When is the long run? A really long time from now. So this is in the long run. Once you've had time to adjust, the capital stock will be 3% larger. And you'll only get to this number if you get a large inflow of capital into the United States without driving our interest rates up. In terms of what this means for output, it is in the long run a 0.9% increase in the level of GDP. Robert Barro has pioneered the growth analysis of convergence and how you get to new steady states based on that, and actually a pretty aggressive convergence rate above the standard one in the literature. You get there faster than you'd normally model it. So you have at the end of the decade, your output is 0.4 higher. So let's pause on that for a moment. What does that mean for growth rates? 0.04 percentage points. So if your growth rate was going to be 2.0, your new growth rate is going to be 2.0 unless you look at the second decimal place. This is something that's going to be very, very hard to see in terms of growth rates. We do a sensitivity analysis. It would actually be my preferred estimate, and one that I think Robert would strongly disagree with, but we both include it in the paper, on what would happen if there's crowd out. We took a very modest assumption that interest rates are 14 basis points higher. So just a little bit higher. That cuts it in half, and the level of output now is 0.2% higher, which is an even smaller impact on the growth rate. How does this compare? I'm going to show you other estimates of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. There's another 8 or so I could have put on this chart. Of the other ones that I left out, half of them fall below Barro-Furman, half of them fall above, and none of them have a growth rate that is higher than 0.1% of 1% per year. The Tax Policy Center is basically 0. The Joint Committee on Taxation, which the head is appointed by the Republicans in Congress, was below 0.04%. The Penn-Wharton budget model is run by a guy named Kent Smetters, who was on the Republican side of the dynamic scoring debate. They have a number that's a little bit higher. But basically, everyone agrees the numbers are quite low, and to the point of whether the tax cut will pay for itself, you'd need to get up to about 0.5 in the growth rate per year for the tax cut to pay for itself. No one thinks we're remotely close to that. So this now leaves the paper that I did with Robert and goes on to the next topic, which is national income. For those of you that are not GDP accounting aficionados, GDP adds up everything in the economy. National income subtracts two things. One, it subtracts the payments we make to foreigners. on the grounds that they're not really a benefit to us. So if you just get rich because you borrow a lot and then you have to repay all of that, you're not quite as rich as you thought you were. The second thing it subtracts is the amount of the capital stock that depreciates, because that's not like a particularly fun thing for anyone. It's just something you need to replace. So national income is actually closer to a welfare measure, closer to what we actually care about in the economy than GDP. And what's important is that that just gives the definition I just gave you. What's important is that national income is not going to go up as much as GDP does. Why? Because we have a larger capital stock, so we have more depreciation. We have a lot more borrowing, so even if our GDP is higher, we're going to need to use more of that GDP not to have fun ourselves, but to repay foreigners, and the deficits also reduce it. I'm not going to spend very much time on this. I don't have a precise estimate of national income, but under one assumption, instead of being up 0.4, it goes up 0.1. Under another assumption, instead of going up 0.2, it goes down by 0.1. It's very easy to get the result that the increase in GDP isn't even large enough to finance the extra repayments you're going to have to make to foreigners, plus replacing the capital stock. National income, by the way, used to be the standard thing that was done in dynamic analysis by researchers, if you look in the top journals, by the Treasury, JCT. Unfortunately, people have moved back to doing GDP. I think they should really do this. There was one letter by CBO after the tax vote that endorsed a conclusion like this, that once you looked at repayments to foreigners, there wasn't any extra income for the country. National income is a decent proxy of how well off people are. As economists, we'd much rather look actually at welfare. And welfare is how well off you are. It would take into account the direct benefits of the tax cuts. It would take into account the fact that higher GDP means higher wages. But it would also take into account there's a cost of repaying the debt that I was talking about. If people are working harder for the extra growth, that isn't quite as good as if the extra growth just plop down on you. And if you have to save a lot to get the extra growth, that means you're reducing consumption today. So you want to take into account you're worse off today, better off in the future. On net, you may be better off, but not by quite as much as just looking at your future income. This is an analysis I've done before called dynamic distributional analysis. It gets pretty tricky in a lot of respects, but for the most part, you can just look at a standard static distribution table, get something close to this, and you'll discover for the majority of people, the law would actually leave them worse off once you take into account all of these issues. Okay, now I want to go to how will we know? You know, we got a good Q2 GDP number. Does that prove that the tax cuts worked? Let's say we get a bad number in Q whatever of some future year. Does that prove the tax cuts failed? No. That's idiotic reasoning. It's just crazy to look at any given data point and say that tells you something about what you want, because there's an enormous amount of noise in the economy. Just to look at what's happened to forecasts, forecasts for GDP growth in 2018 have moved up markedly. This reflects a lot of factors. One of them is the tax cut. So the professional consensus is that because of the tax cut, you're going to have faster GDP growth in 2018. Part of why it's moved up is an improvement in the global outlook. This compares what the IMF was forecasting before the US election to their most recent forecast for GDP growth, the most recent estimate for GDP growth in 2017. You see the United States moved up, other countries moved up even more. And so there's been a general global updraft over the last 2 years that I would argue has more carried the United States than been carried by the United States. But the most important thing is the goal of the policy was not, the legitimate goal of the policy was not just to goose the economy in 2018, it was to increase growth over a longer term. And so what do the professionals think about that? This next is all the forecasts I'm aware of long-run GDP growth. And it takes forecasts that, for the most part, were done before the election or maybe just right after it, and compares them to ones that were done after the tax bill was completed. And you see that almost everyone took their estimate of long-run growth and kept it the same, or lowered it, which is to say the good news from 2017, 2018 was not assumed to continue. Why is that? It's because a lot of that good news was consistent with a Keynesian expansion, which is always temporary. You're goosing demand. It helps you in the short run, not the long run. The estimates showed the long run impacts were basically nil. And if you look at where the growth was coming from, it was largely coming from a falling unemployment rate and rising employment more broadly. That's a temporary phenomenon. You can't keep lowering the unemployment rate forever. To generate sustained growth, it needs to come from productivity growth, and there's not really much sign of that. The variable I would pay the most attention to is wages. The blue line is nominal wages. They've drifted up their growth rate a tiny bit, but the consumer price index has also gone up. Partly that's one-off effects of rising oil. Even taking that away, real wages based on the underlying inflation rate do not appear to have increased. Something CEA did recently that Charlie Calamiris talked about this morning showed higher real wage growth now. It also showed higher in the past, and it showed that was slowing. If you look at investment, there's a lot of different indicators. Generally, they were trending up before the tax cut passed. Generally, they have continued to trend up, but not very consistently. And the measures I have here are the standard set of forward-looking indicators you would have. So not the actual investment that's happened, but what plans are for the future. So you look at like ISM manufacturing, plans have actually gone down since the tax cut passed. If you look at actual investment, there you see a very positive story. You see it on the left-hand side for overall investment. That's distorted by oil. When oil prices are falling, it drags investment down in that sector. When oil prices are rising, it makes it go up. I like to look at business fixed investment excluding the oil and gas sector. That's what you see on the right. No pickup in 2017, but you do see a pickup in 2018. I want to talk, though, about an existential issue, which is this huge uncertainty in the economy. Investment varies enormously for tons of reasons. How can you tell if it's due to the tax cut or not? This next graph shows the underlying uncertainty about investment in the economy. If the tax cut worked, it would push us to the right a little bit, and we'd be at basically the 55th percentile of the uncertainty we've seen historically. In other words, if you got the actual investment data from someone and you tried to figure out whether the tax cut worked or not, that's a little bit like someone has a coin. The coin might be fair, 50-50. It might be weighted 55-45. You get one toss, and based on that one toss of the coin, you have to decide between those two hypotheses. There's just so much noise in the world that trying to extract a policy like this is basically impossible. Want to end briefly with what's next. There's a huge amount of legislative instability. A lot of the pieces of the tax cut will be expiring in different years, as well as the underlying tax code. There's a lot of economic instability, which is that our fiscal course is unsustainable. There's a lot of political instability, and that there's a lack of bipartisan buy-in for this. I think we need tax reform more than ever, and there's three broad approaches to it. One is we could repeal the law and go back to what we had in the law in 2016. I don't think that would be a great idea. The other is we could just take everything in this law that's expiring and make it permanent. I don't think that's a very great idea either. The final is we could do a more fundamental tax reform. If you want to appeal to people that don't like the law, you can call it repeal and replace. If you do want to appeal to Glenn Hubbard, you can call it tax reform. It actually has a lot in common with what he put up in his slide for tax reform. I think the next tax reform should center, don't have a monitor here, so I can't see what's up on the screen. Should center around stability, everything being permanent, efficiency. There's a lot of ways to get that, but I think it's going to be more about improving the tax base rather than worrying about tax rates. So having a tax base that allows you to raise rates and get more revenue, but still preserve efficiency. Simplicity shouldn't be about the number of lines on the tax form. It's about not having to fill out a tax form at all, which you don't have to in a lot of other countries, and helping working and the middle class. My version of this would be to take the expensing provisions that expire and make them permanent. That's a very effective way to encourage business investment. To eliminate the deductibility of interest, which gets at an issue Rana talked about this morning in terms of encouragement for over-leveraging in the economy. Once you do that, you can raise the tax rate to 28%, collect more revenue, and do it while actually lowering the user cost of capital and having more incentives to invest, especially for R&D. If you look at this, skipping to my last slide, using Robert and my model in our paper, we showed that this would add 6% to the level of long-run output. Moreover, it would do this while reducing the deficit, reducing interest rates, and crowding in capital. So I think that would be a much better way forward to figure out what we can do for the next reform rather than just taking all of the problematic elements of this one and making them permanent. Thank you.
Thank you.